Good morning. The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 759 for purposes of markup and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 759, to enhance public safety by improving the effectiveness and efficiency of the federal prison system with offender risk and needs assessment, individual risk reduction incentives and rewards, and risk and recidivism reduction.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Today we consider H.R. 759, the Recidivism Risk Reduction Act, introduced by Congressman Jason Chaffetz. When Ranking Member Conyers and I initiated our criminal justice reform initiative 8 months ago, we said criminal justice is about punishing lawbreakers, protecting the innocent, the fair administration of justice, and fiscal responsibility in a manner that is responsive to the needs of communities. Congress has the responsibility to ensure that our criminal justice system metes out appropriate and effective justice. The committee's initiative will pursue responsible, common-sense criminal justice reforms to make sure our federal laws and regulations punish wrongdoers, protect individual freedom, work as efficiently and fairly as possible, do not duplicate state efforts, and do not waste taxpayer dollars. The measure we are considering today meets all of these objectives. The concept behind H.R. 759 is very simple. We can still be tough on crime while being smart with our criminal justice system. The bill places a new focus on rehabilitation, not just punishment and incarceration. It establishes a risk and needs assessment as the foundation of an effective recidivism reduction program and, more importantly, an efficient and effective federal prison system. H.R. 759 will incentivize prisoners to participate in recidivism reduction programs and jobs that actually reduce their risk of recidivism. Why is this important? Well, it is important for two main reasons. First, the Bureau of Prisons has a growing prison population that, because of its rising costs, is becoming a real and immediate threat to public safety. The growing prison budget is consuming an ever-increasing percentage of the Department of Justice's budget. The more dollars we put into prison population translates to fewer dollars we can invest in criminal and national security investigations and prosecutions. Second, we know that without programming and intervention, prisoners are more likely than not to recidivate. We cannot allow the cycle to continue. By using a targeted approach for each prisoner, we can lower the risk of recidivism. Fewer recidivists mean fewer prisoners in the future and even greater savings to the American taxpayer. This bill is important because when prisoners who have received intervention are released, they are less likely to commit crimes and more likely to become productive members of our society, something that we all should support. When that happens, our streets and our innocent citizens are safer. An added benefit is former prisoners are more likely to leave the life of crime behind and become productive members of society and contribute to our communities. I want to thank the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for introducing this innovative and much-needed piece of legislation, and all the other members who have contributed to this carefully negotiated product. And I now yield to the ranking member and a major partner in working on criminal justice reform, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte. I commend you and all the other co-sponsors for bringing H.R. 759 before the committee today. And I'm pleased that today we will consider a bipartisan substitute amendment to this bill, which will establish a better way of operating our prisons. It's critical that as a part of our ongoing efforts to reform our criminal justice system, that we take action to improve our federal prisons at the same time. The massive growth of our prison population is a crisis in both human and fiscal terms. Over the past 4 decades, the United States prison population has skyrocketed. Since the early 1970s, the U.S. prison population has grown from 200,000 to over 2 million persons, and since 1980, the rate of imprisonment at the federal level has grown by more than 500%. As a result, annual federal spending on prisons has increased from $970 million in 1980 to more than $6.5 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars. The Department of Justice's expenditures on prisons now constitute more than 20% of its total outlays. This trend is unsustainable. While imprisonment is appropriate and necessary for some offenders, we must address this crisis by making fundamental changes to the federal system. The first and essential step is reforming our sentencing laws to ensure that sentences are not inappropriately and counterproductively long. And this committee last year approved a bipartisan bill that is a good first step toward doing so. Now, by taking up legislation concerning prison reform, we're taking another important step toward changing our approach to incarceration. For too long, our prisons have simply warehoused individuals whom we know will eventually return to society. For their benefit and ours, we must adopt a more constructive approach. That's why I support establishing a system in federal prisons that will encourage prisoners to participate in programs that will improve their lives, both inside and outside prison, and that will reduce their risk of committing additional offenses when they are released. This is the goal of this legislation. That's the goal of this legislation. It simply makes sense that we provide incentives for prisoners to be better prepared to reenter society and be productive members of their communities. I look forward to the discussion and adoption of the substitute amendment, which will greatly improve the underlying bill and which will constitute a good first step toward making our federal prison system more humane, more effective, and less costly. I thank the chair. You back.
The chair thanks the gentleman and is now pleased to recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, and Investigations, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her opening statement.
Let me thank the chairman very much, and I'd like to thank the ranking member, as well as Mr. Chavitz, Mr. Gowdy, Mr. Richmond, Mr. Jeffries, for making the statement about a number of issues that I think are important and have taken the interest and the notice of the American people, and a number of organizations and groups and people who have spoken about mass incarceration, but they've also spoken about what we do when we incarcerate persons. And I think that this is a very important collaborative statement of the House Judiciary Committee for both Republicans and Democrats that I hope, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, will be on the President's desk. And that will certainly take collaboration with the other body. The legislation that we will move today is not only a meaningful and significant product of that collaboration, but an absolutely critical next step in enacting comprehensive criminal justice reform. Our work is not done, but when we finish here today, we must dig right back in so that we can bring youth justice and policing reform bills to this committee in the coming weeks. In the backdrop of this particular markup, we have seen the Justice Department work with Ferguson for what I believe is an important consent order that hopefully after court proceedings, Ferguson will see a better day of improvement around the issues of criminal justice. But today we have the opportunity to introduce or to present H.R. 759, the Recidivism Risk Reduction Act, which has a wonderful federal prison reform. I have very many federal prisons in and around my congressional district and a federal detention center. I visited them all. This bill offers meaningful strategies. This legislation is truly common sense, determines what the prisoners needs, match the prisoner with programming to address those needs, and encourages the prisoner to take full advantage of the programming through time off their prison sentence. This is not a handout. It is a hand up. It is not for naysayers of treating prisoners soft. It is for investing in Americans and investing in families and investing in young people who were steered in the wrong direction and now incarcerated but have a second chance. It recognizes the urgent need for a recidivism risk reduction program in the Bureau of Prisons. It gives to the federal government the bully pulpit to be able to say to other states, you can get this done, you can do this right. This is the way that you will have productive citizens when they are released. Allowing prisoners who successfully participate in programming to earn time off, good time. Their prison sentence is not just a smart way to encourage rehabilitation, it is a responsible way to decrease costs and crowding. $70 billion is spent annually on incarceration. And while there are a number of improvements to be made to H.R. 759 as evidenced by the substitute amendment, we'll soon consider this legislation sets forth a strong foundation. It cannot be overstated, the purpose and the need for meaningful prison reform. The unfortunate reality is that our federal government is our nation's largest jailer. Is despite the fact that 95% of the inmates re-enter society, we have failed to partner on while they're incarcerated with an emphasis on re-entry. And so I would, again, commend the authors of H.R. 759, delighted as a ranking member on the Crime Subcommittee to be part of moving this bill forward, and will be offering a bipartisan amendment. And H.R. 759 can have a direct positive impact on the lives of millions of Americans, and I call on my colleagues to support it once it is amended. 630,000 individuals who re-enter each year, few are up for success. We now have an opportunity to change those numbers. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The Chair thanks the gentlewoman. Without objection, all their members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. I now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 759 offered by Mr. Chaffetz. Strike all after the enacting clause.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read, and I will recognize Mr. Chaffetz to explain his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
I thank the chairman, and I appreciate your leadership, Mr. Chairman, on this issue and bringing together one of the most impressive bipartisan groups and pieces of legislation that we've had. I want to thank you. I want to thank Congressman Gowdy. I also want to particularly thank Cedric Richmond and Hakeem Jeffries for their passion and work on this issue, spending countless hours working with us on this. I also want to thank Ranking Member Conyers and his passion for this. In the Senate, Senator Cornyn, Senator Lee, and Senator Booker have been particularly helpful in a good bipartisan way bringing this together. We have important additions to the bill from Congressman Marino and Congresswoman Jackson Lee that improve the quality of this bill and address some topics that I know Mr. Marino and Ms. Jackson Lee are also very, very passionate about. But we have a choice in this country. We have to understand, Mr. Chairman, that 95% of the people that go to prison, they're coming back out. So are they going to come back out and be better criminals? Or are we actually going to engage with these people and hope that we can reduce the rate of recidivism? Because that ought to be our goal. We want them to become productive citizens. Something's gone awry, something for whatever reason is off track. There are certain criminals that shouldn't come out, that shouldn't be able to earn extra time. There are 48 exclusions in this bill for people for everything from terrorism to crimes against children and other heinous crimes that you're just not going to qualify for this. But let's also understand, Mr. Chairman, too, that in the federal prison system, we're at about 120 to 140% of capacity. And what we don't want to do as a nation is do what California did. California had overpopulation. What did they do? They just released them en masse. That is not the direction that we should be going. There should be a way to do what the states have done. And there are leading states out there like Texas and Utah and Ohio and South Carolina and Georgia that are actually reducing the rate of recidivism and saving billions of dollars along the way. I would point back to the Department of Justice Inspector General who testified before Congress in 2013, said, quote, "It's clear that something must be done. The department cannot solve this challenge by spending more money to operate more federal prisons unless it is prepared to make drastic cuts to other important areas of the department's operations." Let's understand that 1/3, roughly, of the Department of Justice budget goes to the Bureau of Prisons. 1/3. We're spending nearly $30,000 per person per year to incarcerate these folks. There's a punishment component. There is a debt to society. There are some very valid reasons, but there, as the states have learned, there are some key indicators that if, again, you're not engaged in some of the most heinous crimes, if you are participating in a post-sentencing world, in working at the prison, if you're furthering your education, if you're engaged in faith-based services, these are all key indicators that maybe you're moving in the right direction. And again, with 48 exclusions, let's learn from the states. Let's, as fiscal conservatives, understand we got to figure out how to save money, but let's also engage in be truly the Department of Corrections, because I think that is ultimately the goal. I want to, again, as I stated before with this amendment in the nature of a substitute, want to thank Mr. Marino. He included some important provisions regarding pepper spray, that the people that work in our prisons, they do a very difficult job. We cannot thank them enough for what they do. He also has a provision there that dealing with gun lockers, something that should be easily dealt with. Ms. Jackson-Lee adding a component, for instance, restraints during pregnancy. These are common sense things that do need to be addressed. And Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to introduce two different letters. One is from 36 former prosecutors, a judge, other government officials. We also have a letter from former Attorney General Michael McCasey, former FBI Director William Sessions, former FBI Director Louis Freeh, talking about the concepts involved in here. And I would also point, Mr. Chairman, to the success that a version of this bill has had in the Senate, again, bringing together a broad bipartisan support. I hope members will take a good hard look at this, but I do appreciate the good bipartisan support. I think this is ready for a vote here in this committee and look forward to bringing it to the floor sooner rather than later. And I thank you again for your leadership on this bill, and I yield back.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. Without objection, the two letters referenced will be made a part of the record. And the Chair is now pleased to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to join Congressman Chaffetz, Chairman Goodlatte, and especially Subcommittee Ranking Member Sheila Jackson-Lee, and Crime Subcommittee Chairman Jim Sensenbrenner, and other colleagues for sponsoring this substitute amendment. All of us have worked hard, although not always in agreement. We've been able to develop this compromise measure. While I had hoped that the eligibility for earning credits under this system would have been more broad, I still believe it will change the operation of our federal prison system in very important ways. While this bill does not address a range of issues related to the way our system treats juvenile offenders, I look forward to working with the chairman and many of my colleagues here to develop legislation in this area as our next order of business. I thank the chairman and my colleagues for coming together to develop this bipartisan substitute amendment, and of course I urge its adoption. And I yield back the balance of my time. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Conyers. I have an amendment at the desk to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, and just on the amendment,
Uh,
the same thing?
Let me put this amendment in, and then we'll recognize you for that purpose. And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 759, offered by Mr. Goodlatte, page 10, line 18, insert before the period at the end.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and I will recognize myself for a brief statement. This is a technical and conforming amendment. It makes various technical changes throughout the amendment in the nature of a substitute and reflects agreed upon and negotiated language. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I support the pending amendment, and I'd like to also speak to the Chavez, Jackson Lee, Goodlatte, Conyers.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Strike the last word. Thank you so very much. Very briefly, let me just say again, I want to raise this number, 630,000 individuals who re-enter each year out of our prisons. And so I think this bill clearly speaks to many of the issues both inside a prison system and out. And I was glad to be able to provide more opportunity for program innovation and pilot programs in this amendment, adding parenting skills and parent-child interaction, broadening life skills to cover rejection response and anti-bullying that may occur both inside the prison and outside for the prisoner or the released individual to be able to address these travails of life without then becoming incarcerated again, broadening the program list to cover arts programs, trauma treatment, expanding recidivism partnerships to include arts organization, making it easier for recidivism reduction partners to provide programming, allowing prisoners to earn credits for programming pre-sentencing, and also allowing prisoners to take care of animals. That is a very interesting process, and I look forward to it. And the amendment also includes important reentry aspects dealing with facilities and a facilitator to help that particular inmate reentry. Let me also thank Ms. Bass for her commitment dealing with a matter that we work to get in, her commitment and support of the idea of the way pregnant women are treated, to eliminate the shackling. And I think this responds to the needs of prisoners who are incarcerated, but also invest in those who are being released for the betterment of the American people. I ask my colleagues to support the Chavez, Jackson Lee, Goodlatte, Conyers substitute amendment. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlewoman. For what purpose the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, for the record, I would like to recognize two people in the audience, Don and Jean Williams. They are back there. Please stand. Thank you. Mr. and Mrs. Williams are the parents of Eric Williams. And 3 years ago this month, Eric was killed, brutally murdered in Canaan Federal Prison by an inmate who has since then is in the process of being prosecuted. But Eric had no defense. He didn't have anything to defend himself from the multiple stabbings, not on one occasion, but this defendant chased him and continued to stab him until he was dead. That's why a group of us got together at the behest of my friends, the Williams, and I see my colleagues, former officers from the prison as well, to address a piece of legislation that went into this overall legislation, and thank you and thank Chairman Chaffetz for the pepper spray. Just a simple device like a can of pepper spray, I am convinced would have prevented Eric from being murdered. And now we are going to get this in the prisons where all the personnel have this. And I thank you for that, and I thank the Williams family for being here. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and Chair thanks the Williams for being here as well. And we're sorry for your loss, and we hope that we can do something to avoid that happening to federal prison employees in the future. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
For purpose, the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition.
to support the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I join you, Chairman Goodlatte, in support of the Goodlatte-Conyers amendment to H.R. 759, which includes several updates to provisions in the bill which have been agreed to on a bipartisan basis. Some of the changes fix technical errors, and others largely amend the text to conform it to what we had attended in the bipartisan agreement on the text of the substitute. I thank the chairman again for working with me on this issue, and I urge adoption of this amendment. I've never used the word bipartisan so much in a bill that I can remember here on the Judiciary Committee. I yield back. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. For purposes, the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for recognizing again, I think just was brought out a moment ago from my friend from Pennsylvania, the importance of this work and my sympathies as well. But it brings out what we're doing here today is important on a lot of different levels. But Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for working to bring this forward, this bipartisan legislation to reform the federal prison system. I'm proud to join you as a co-sponsor of the amendment. I also want to thank Mr. Chaffetz for his work in introducing H.R. 759 and on this amendment. Before I speak to the nature of the bill, I want to make it clear that I believe that when people break the law, there should be consequences. Punishment should fit the crime, and justice should be served. I stand firm on this and have never wavered. However, that does not prevent me from believing that each and every one of us was created in God's image, and every person has value. Those who commit crimes should be punished. We should also offer a chance at redemption to those who can safely reintegrate into society. And we need a system that provides a chance for success after that time has been served. Too often, the current system sets offenders up for failure by forcing people back into the same or worse circumstances that led to the crime in the first place. The amendment before us offers sensible solutions to reduce recidivism, which in turn reduces the burden to taxpayers and to increase public safety. The bill also includes protections fundamental to our legal system. Mr. Jeffries and I authored legislation to ensure that the age-old and well-established right to attorney-client privilege is available to federal inmates and their legal representatives. I am proud to say that this legislation is reflected in the amendment. I want to thank Mr. Jeffries for his commitment and partnership, and Chairman Goodlatte and Ranking Member Conyers for their willingness to work with us on this issue. Currently, electronic communications are treated differently than traditional forms of communication, such as snail mail or phone calls for the purposes of attorney-type privilege. The use of email to communicate with an attorney is tantamount to signing away the right of privileged communication. This creates considerable hurdles to an attorney and an inmate exercising their right to privileged communications. This is not sensible. As methods of communication change, so too should the system. This provision ensures that critical legal protections do not fall by the wayside simply because technology has changed. Importantly, the language also establishes a retention policy for these communications if a court determines that the crime fraud exemption to the attorney-type privilege exists. The amendment contains numerous other meaningful provisions, including the creation of an offender risk and needs assessment system. It creates a sensible earned time credit system and ensures that pregnant women are treated in a way that better protects both them and the life of their unborn child. It provides for better safety protections for the Bureau of Prisons employees, and this bill also establishes important de-escalation training to better recognize the unique needs of the mentally ill offenders. It's time we make reforms to strengthen our public safety and reduce costs and better help released offenders adjust to society rather than recidivism. This is something that I have had the privilege of witnessing in Georgia, and the issues that we have dealt with in Georgia, which were when I first entered the General Assembly back in 2006 to where we are now, has been an amazing transformation. The use of accountability courts, the use of alternative means to take those, as our governor said and I have said on many times, there has to be a determination in our society in which we have space and we have the facilities to lock up those people that we're scared of, and we have to work better with those that we're just mad at. And that's something that we've got to work at. So as we go forward with this, Mr. Chairman, and the others part of this, I just appreciate your work and hard work on this and look forward to the support on this bill. And with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks, gentlemen. For purposes, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Bass, seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to express my real appreciation for the hard work from all of the committee members that went into this bill. Aside from providing critical tools to help inmates reduce their sentences and prepare for life after incarceration, this bill will enhance safety by training correction officers in de-escalation techniques that reduce conflict and violence in prison. I'm really heartened to see the committee doing criminal justice reform work in a way that puts human dignity and restoration at the core, and I hope that this work continues. I also want to thank the members for working with me to insert my legislation to protect pregnant inmates. We worked together to develop language that will prevent the unnecessary shackling of pregnant incarcerated women. In California, we outlawed this practice, but I was shocked to learn that in some states, women have actually been chained down while giving birth. There was an example of a woman in Nevada that suffered agonizing muscle tearing and bone separation because she was chained down during labor and couldn't move. According to the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, physical restraints have interfered with the ability of physicians to safely practice medicine by reducing their ability to assess and evaluate the physical condition of the mother and fetus, and have similarly made the labor and delivery process more difficult than it needs to be. It's my hope that by codifying this standard, we'll send a message that incarcerated women should be treated humanly, especially while pregnant, giving birth, and recovering. There are some provisions related to shackling pregnant women that didn't make it into the bill that I think we should still work on down the line. For instance, I think we need better data collection on pregnant inmates and prison births. I'd like to know about the quality of care for pregnant women in prison and know the demographic information about such women, including their offenses and their sentences. Another provision not included was a deadline for the Bureau of Prisons to establish a process for inmates to report shackling in violation of this act. Finally, I'd like to work with the committee on legislation to address shackling pregnant women on the state level. I'm pleased that 23 states have anti-shackling codes on their books, but I'd like to work with the committee to see how we can incentivize other states to codify a standard of care, much like the one we're advancing here. Again, I'm very pleased to see this bill move forward, and I look forward to working together on other ways to improve our justice system. I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentlewoman and looks forward to working with her moving forward. For purpose, the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition.
I will move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and to our ranking member and the chairman and the ranking member of the subcommittees, I just wanted to, one, thank them for the hard work and recognize the bipartisan manner in which this was done, and just offer just a few words. And that's to say that this bill is about safety. It's about safety inside of our correctional institutions to make sure that our guards can go to work every day and that they can return home to their families in one piece. And that is very important, and the Marino Amendment allows us to do that, to help them do that. Second, it's about safety for society. And what we realized a long time ago, that we have long passed the point of diminishing returns. Every dollar that we spend on incarceration actually makes the country less safe, because it's money that could go to programs and other things that could make communities safer and prevent crime. And when we talk about recidivism, most of the time we talk about recidivism in terms of the fact that if we can keep guys from coming back to prison, guys or women from coming back to prison, we don't have to spend that money on them. Well, that's true. But let's think of it this way too. Every person that we prevent from coming back to prison means that there's one less victim out there. So when we talk about this bill to reduce recidivism, we're going to save money and we're going to prevent future victims of crime. And I think that those are the things that when Congress can come together and come up with a goal and give and take a little bit so that we can achieve that goal, it becomes a success and a win. Does this bill do everything that I would like it to do and as aggressive as I would like it to be done? The answer is no. But in a democracy, when you really want to get something done, you're going to give a little bit and you're going to take a little bit, and you hope that at the end of the day, you move to make the country a little bit better. And here we move to make the country a little bit better, but we hope to make people a little bit safer. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would just again like to applaud the effort, I think, of everybody on the committee and urge support of the legislation.
Chair thanks the gentleman. For purpose, to the gentleman from New York seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership, and I want to thank Ranking Member Conyers, the ranking members, and the chairman of the subcommittees, Representative Chaffetz, of course, Cedric Richmond, and many, many others who worked together in a bipartisan fashion to bring us to this moment. As has been mentioned, this is not a perfect bill, but in the legislative process, the perfect should never be the enemy of the good. This legislation is a significant step toward meaningful reform of a broken criminal justice system which remains overcrowded and underfunded. If enacted into law, this bill will encourage rehabilitation, promote successful reentry, and save taxpayer dollars. States like New York, Texas, South Carolina, and Georgia have all reduced their prison populations while at the same time experienced a significant decrease in crime and saved precious taxpayer dollars. We can now do the same thing at the federal level. This bill contains several important provisions, including a risk assessment tool and a requirement that the Attorney General regularly review that tool to identify any potential disparities. In addition, the bill provides incarcerated individuals with a right to appeal any adverse determination of their recidivism risk. This appeal is to be heard by the warden, and I note this provision is not in the Senate bill. That's an important step that we've taken. The inclusion of de-escalation training in this bill should result in dramatic improvements to the quality of life for all inmates, especially those who suffer from mental illness, while simultaneously making the prison environment safer for both prison guards who put their life on the line, as well as incarcerated individuals. Lastly, the legislation corrects a current practice where federal prosecutors review email communications between Bureau of Prison inmates and their attorneys in contravention of the Sixth Amendment. The distinguished gentleman from Georgia, my good friend Representative Collins, and I have worked together on this provision, and I want to thank him specifically for his partnership and his leadership on this issue. Lastly, given that all inmates are eventually released, it is in our best interest for everyone to be able to participate in programming designed to promote successful reentry. I think we should explore expanding that eligibility and the opportunity to earn good time credits as we move this process forward, since proven recidivism reduction programming like family and phone visitation should be as broadly available as possible. That is in everyone's best interest. Reforming our broken criminal justice system is fiscally prudent and socially responsible. And in this spirit, I look forward to working with the chairman, the ranking member, and individuals on both sides of the aisle who've come together in good faith to bring us to this moment. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Mr. Marino from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Congressman Jordan. First of all, I would like to recognize Helen Averati, if she could please stand. Helen, thank you for being here. Helen's husband, who worked at the prison, was killed on the way to prison. And another piece of this legislation that we are working on, believe it or not, federal guards are not allowed to carry weapons to a federal prison. So we have put in legislation, and thank Chairman Gooden and Chairman Chaffetz and Mr. Conyers again, that allows correction officers who are clearly trained and need the protection to carry a weapon with them, and it can be safely and securely locked down in a box in the facility. But I also want to thank Chairman Goodlatte, Chairman Chaffetz, Chairman Conyers, Ranking Member Conyers, and others for this legislation. I was a prosecutor for 18 years, and I have a reputation of being a tough prosecutor. If you're going to commit the crime, you are going to do the time. But it's important because there are too many people going back to prison. And just as vehemently as I want to put the bad guys away, I want to just as aggressively make sure that we have programs that can at least help a portion of those individuals from going back to prison, seeing that they have the education, they have training, they have counseling that's ongoing and just not put back on the streets, and to make them citizens that can contribute to society. So I want to thank everyone for putting that part of the legislation, of my legislation, in the overall bill as well. We are tightening, another part of the legislation is we're tightening up the credit standards for serious rehab programs. There are many programs, but we've got to make sure there are serious rehab programs. I want to thank also my colleague and former U.S. Attorney Brett Tolan from Utah. And Brett's here, and thank you very much for what you have done in this. This legislation, again, is a serious start to curtail people from going back to prison. But make no mistake about it. If you commit a serious crime, you are going to do serious time in a federal prison. And I yield back.
Yield back.
Mr.
Chair,
Chairman.
thanks. The gentleman, for purposes, the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, I encouraged strongly the committee to come forward with legislation on criminal justice reform, and the chairman is to be congratulated and commended for bringing forth this legislation, and also the ranking member, John Conyers. I want to also send out my appreciation to Ranking Member Jackson Lee, along with Crime Subcommittee Chair Sensenbrenner, for bringing this legislation forward, and my friend Jason Chaffetz, the sponsor of this legislation, along with Cedric Richmond and Hakeem Jeffries, along with Trey Gowdy, have done yeoman's work on this bill in a bipartisan way, and they are to be commended, along with Representative Karen Bass, Tom Marino, and Doug Collins for their fine work. This is a common sense bill. It's a bipartisan bill. I think members of Congress, particularly on this committee, can take great, well, this is an example of what the public expects Congress to do. This is an example that should make the American people proud of their representatives, and with that, I will yield back. I ask my colleagues to pass this bill.
Chair thanks the gentleman. For purposes, the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Conyers for your extraordinary leadership on this bill, and thank Representative Chaffetz and Representative Richmond and Representative Bass, Representative Jackson Lee, and Representative Sensenbrenner, and Representative Jeffries, who contributed enormously to the final product that we'll consider today. For too long, the federal government has failed to invest in strategies that reduce the likelihood that those released from prison will return again, committing more crimes, impacting more families, creating more suffering from victims of crime, as well as those families of individuals who are sent back to prison. And as a result of this failure to have a strategy to really focus on this, from 1980 to 2013, the rate of imprisonment by our federal government grew by 518%, increasing from 11 inmates per 100,000 U.S. residents to 68 inmates per 100,000 residents. And during that same period of time, spending increased from $970 million to $6.7 billion in inflation-adjusted spending. So the costs of our failure to really respond to this are enormous. And beyond the financial costs, of course, the importance of focusing on reducing recidivism and enabling people to successfully reenter the community is that we also reduce the societal costs of imprisonment, which are enormous and fall disproportionately on low-income communities, communities of color, and particularly vulnerable communities, particularly those with mental illness. So this legislation really begins to change that in a very important and fundamental way by allowing for the development of strategies really to promote successful reentry, to increase public safety by reducing the likelihood that people will recommit or commit additional crimes, increasing the safety of our prisons and the safety of our correctional officers, making sure that prisons are operated in a more humane way, more consistent with our values. And I think this is an extraordinary bipartisan effort. I commend everyone who's been a part of it, and I am proud to be a co-sponsor and urge all of my colleagues to proudly vote yes on this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
There's an amendment pending right now, my amendment to the substitute amendment.
I'm sorry. I would await the amendment.
Who seeks recognition on this amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Iowa has an amendment. We'll consider his first.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
This,
What purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Okay, which amendment are we?
this is the amendment that deals with the first-time felons.
Very good. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 759 offered by Mr. King of Iowa. Page 19.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment addresses a situation that under the bill and under the bill as amended, it allows for those who have already been proven recidivists that have been released and come back on subsequent charges, convictions on subsequent charges, to also get a second chance. And I submit that they've had their first chance when they're proven recidivists. And so what my amendment does is that it prohibits an inmate with a second or a subsequent felony conviction, whether it be state or federal, and it expands this to the state and federal, from earning credits under the bill. And you know, we don't need to start with proven recidivists on an unproven program. We don't know whether we can help them or not. This bill is a social experiment, and I suggest let's first experiment with the people who have only had one conviction and are serving time for that conviction or combination of convictions, and limit it to those rather than opening this up for a second or subsequent convictions. The proven recidivists shouldn't get this second chance. They've already had their second chance, and I'm somewhat familiar with what happens with crime victims, and I know that I have quoted from studies in the past on the price to society for releasing criminals out onto the streets. And when this topic first came up some year and a half or so ago, I remember asking the main proponents of the bill if they had looked at the other side of this equation, if they had done the studies and evaluated the available studies to see that if you let a certain number of criminals out of prison, there will be an amount of recidivism. And that recidivism we're talking about as if it were somehow benign or it's not even quantified. And I can tell you that we need to quantify it, and we need to understand it's individual crime victims that will pay the price for an overexuberance here on a bill that I think releases too many too early that need to still pay their price to society, and even if they are not recovered, at the time that they're in prison keeps them from committing crimes against innocent people. And so this says give them a second chance, but not give them a third chance. So the first chance was when they committed the crime in the first place. The second chance was when they did their time, and we give them an opportunity to be let out early. That's what this amendment would allow. But if you've already done your time, been released, committed a crime, and you're back in again, then that universe of inmates should not be considered under this bill. That is the philosophy that this amendment brings. I think it's sound. If we're going to do social experiments, then we should do it in the safest zones that we can and walk into this thing slowly, not dive into this thing head first. And so that's what this amendment does, and I believe that it is the right and prudent way for us to go forward, if we should go forward at all with this bill. I'd urge its adoption, and I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman from Utah insist on his point of order?
Yes, I insist on my point of order. Mr. Chairman, the gentleman
recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman from Iowa's amendment seeks to amend a clause in the bill that was already amended in the Goodlatte amendment, which was agreed to. An amendment may not amend already amended text, therefore I must insist on my point of order.
Does the gentleman from Iowa offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'm going to do a rare thing here today, and I'm going to concede to the validity of the argument of my colleague from Utah, and I'll also concede the point of order. And I would Ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
The gentleman's amendment is withdrawn. And for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition now?
Mr. Chairman, I have another amendment at the desk
The clerk will report.
dealing with
the
immigration.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 759 offered by Mr. King of Iowa.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an amendment that arises out of the review of the bill and understanding that those who are unlawfully present in America are going to be included in this get out of jail early proposal that's there, and also be included in the training programs that help them qualify for points in order to qualify for early release. And especially if it's a second or a subsequent offense, which, by the way, my earlier amendment being out of order, legitimately out of order, I would reiterate, it keeps us from addressing this as far as first-time offenders, but we could have multiple offenders. We could have people in prison that are, say, for example, the murder of Kate Steinle could conceivably qualify under this bill. And I believe that, as my amendment does, it prohibits those who are in prison for illegal entry from qualifying, and it's a perverse incentive. If you're facing potentially a 2-year penalty for unlawful entry into the United States, you end up in a United States federal prison for that purpose. We might cut that sentence in half by they could earn training credits. We could be training a workforce for the countries they came from and should go back to. And I might even concede that getting them back to that home country with a trained workforce is an improvement for those countries, but we're not turning them back to their home country in enough instances. This administration has refused to enforce the law, and often we have people released from our penitentiaries that should be going directly to the border for direct deportation, and we find out they're on the streets committing crimes against Americans. And so that's the essence of this bill, and of this amendment, excuse me. And I urge its adoption, and I would yield back the balance.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate him bringing up this subject because it is an important one and it needs to be carefully addressed. People who enter this country illegally and commit crimes should be sent out of the country. Some, like the murderer of Kate Steinle, re-entered the country on a number of occasions and it finally wound up in a horrific tragedy regarding her murder, and therefore keeping them in prison for the longest time possible to avoid that kind of thing is well worth considering. However, I think we need to take it into context very carefully. So I'd ask the gentleman to consider withdrawing the amendment and working with us on this issue, and also taking note of the fact that the whole purpose of Mr. Chaffetz's bill is to make sure that people in prison get the opportunity to receive training, to receive treatment of various kinds and so on, to make recidivism less likely, and hopefully also to make it less likely that if they're sent home, they stay home. But the gentleman's concern is a legitimate one, and so I would be happy to work with him on it if he would agree to withdraw and work with us as we move to the floor.
In reclaiming my time and appreciating the chairman's argument here, there are a number of things that, of course, I'm interested in looking at, and I want to make sure that we can protect the citizens of this country to the maximum amount. And I think that your proposal here, Mr. Chairman, fits with that overall broad theme that I brought here to the committee today. And I would look forward to working with you and other members of this committee and in an effort to, let's just say, work towards the perfection of the bill and this ideal. So with that, at that request, I would ask unanimous consent to withdraw this amendment.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The amendment is withdrawn. Who seeks recognition? What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Have an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Gomer. Section 110, early release date threshold.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend all the work and all those who did the work on this bill. It is addressing an important subject. I'm very glad my friend Mr. Marino has given prison officials additional tools to protect themselves. So the tools are good. I don't want to affect or delay them whatsoever. But this administration has demonstrated things that ought to concern everybody in here. You look at the Bergdahl trade. Take a guy that's now charged with desertion and trade him for 5 people, some of whom will kill Americans, kill Christians, kill Jews, who, when we look at the number of people who've been released by this administration, even in violation of the law by not giving Congress notice, it's a clear indication that the best interest of the American people have not been at the forefront of all of the policies. The recidivism rate for those released from Gitmo has already shown that the actions of choosing and releasing people by this administration will cause future Americans to lose their lives, their limbs, their property. When we look at this administration's policy going back to Fast and Furious, we still have not gotten the documents that this Congress asked for. We don't know who brought about such an egregious thing that continues to cause and be a part of killing Americans, not to mention all the Mexicans that have likely been killed by the weapons this administration forced into the hands of criminals. I saw the article from January 6th of this year entitled, Justice Department Plans Attorney Hiring Spree to Keep Pace with Obama's Pardon Push. Says the Justice Department will drastically increase the number of attorneys it has on staff to deal with what is expected to be a massive push by President Obama to grant clemency to federal prisoners before the end of his term. It also says the number of expected hires is more than double the agency's staffing level as of May 2013. Over past decades, we've seen crime rates go up and we've seen them go down. And it seems that as you watch the pendulum swing back and forth, that when we are tougher on crime, have tougher sentences, the crime rates go down. And then there were periods in the last few decades when, or going back 5 decades, where we saw the pendulum swing back. We got less tough on crime. Crime rates went up. We started releasing more people more quickly. Crime rates went back up. We see crime rates going up now as we see the pendulum swinging back, especially in the last 7 years under this administration, with what appears to be more concerns for the criminals than for their victims. So my concern is not with the tools that we give prison officials to protect themselves and to enforce the law. My concern is with the judgment of this administration. And the current Attorney General said she didn't see any problems with the way the prior Attorney General enforced the law, and we know he didn't enforce it properly. So my amendment is to try to protect those lives and limbs and property that will be adversely affected by the judgments of this administration, so that it simply delays the date by which anyone may be released from incarceration. I realize the bill uses incarcerated prisoner, and this says incarcerated individual because it should apply to everyone. No one should be released from prison before April 1st, 2017, so that another Attorney General and his or her staff will have time to review it. That's why I make the amendment and ask for your support.
The Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes himself. First of all, I want to thank the gentleman for his concern about this issue and for his comments and for his intentions, but I cannot support the amendment. A couple of things. I think that this should be considered in the overall picture on criminal justice reform. For one thing, the President has been engaged in a very aggressive pardoning process, far beyond what I've seen previous presidents do, and I expect to see that to accelerate the rest of this year, and I do not approve of that. That is one of the reasons why we are doing this legislation and the whole criminal justice reform process here, because it's the Congress's responsibility to change how we do things, and not the President's to abuse the pardon power, which I believe he is doing. Secondly, I think the Sentencing Reform Commission has begun the process by which a number of prisoners are being released right now. And I don't think they got it right either. And again, that's the reason why the Congress should be taking this responsibility and why we should be doing it. But this bill that we're considering today will not be affected by this date. First of all, I want to assure the gentleman that the truth in sentencing is still retained and made explicit in this bill. Secondly, no prisoner is released. They are pre-released to home confinement or to a halfway house. And the date of enactment of this bill is as yet unknown, and 6 months just to develop the post-sentencing risk and needs assessment will, I think, obviate the date that the gentleman has offered. So the system is not likely to be in place to effectuate a release under this bill before the date of amendment. However, the sentencing reform bill does include, under certain circumstances, for prisoners who meet certain criteria, when the mandatory sentences are modified, some people who are in prison today will receive retroactive reductions, and that would fit right into the gentleman's concern. So I think moving forward overall, the gentleman may want to look at that. That measure has already passed out of this committee, but there will be opportunities between now and the floor, and on the floor, and after the floor as we negotiate with the Senate to make sure that we have a good plan for the release of prisoners who benefit from what this law finally winds up being. And the gentleman's concern in that regard is very well taken. But I don't think it fits the measure that we're considering today for the reasons that I have outlined, and therefore I can't support the amendment as offered. And I thank the gentleman. The question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking members and the other people who've worked together to bring this bill to us. I understand the makeup of this committee. Those of us who are on this committee are here generally because we have a strong belief in issues that are controversial and are dealt with by this committee. And we have districts that can sometimes survive having those strong opinions. Accordingly, there's a great divergence in opinion, maybe the strongest differences of opinion in this committee of any committee in Congress. And it makes it all the more amazing that the chairman and the ranking member and Chairman Sensenbrenner and Ranking Member Lee have been able to bring together a bill, and it's a good bill that doesn't go as far as I'd like. It doesn't go as far as Mr. Gomer might like, or Mr. King, or some other people, but that's the way you get legislation passed, is you get some progress and you're satisfied with it. I've filed some amendments I would like to have brought up, but understanding the situation, I won't bring them up to a vote. But I do think that reform of our cannabis laws are real important in criminal justice. More people end up in jail because of marijuana than any other product in our society. And today, 58% of Americans believe marijuana should be legalized, and 85% think medical marijuana should be legalized. And when you put somebody in jail and take away their liberty and force them to hire a lawyer and possibly deny them a scholarship, deny them housing and public housing, and deny them a job forever, that's wrong. And that's why people don't believe in our criminal justice system, and that's why Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are getting a lot of their votes, because people are turned off to this place because Congress is not responsive to issues that affect everyday Americans. And everyday Americans know that the whole policy we've got on drugs, and particularly marijuana, is wrong and out of step with America. We are putting people in jail for engaging in an activity that the president has said is less harmful than alcohol. And many people agree with that and think that it should not be criminalized. Now, I have an amendment that would make it, take it away from scheduling so that marijuana would be left to the states, and have another amendment that would make it Schedule 2, that would at least allow science to have more opportunity to see medical efficacies that could help people. I had a constituent die, a young lady, of epileptic seizures, and there's a part of the psychotic, or not psychotic, but psychotropic, it's not psychotropic, but it's the part of the marijuana that doesn't get you high, the cannabinoids, that is called Charlotte's Web. And Charlotte's Web can help children with epileptic seizures and save their lives. And that ought to be studied to see what it does. And it ought to be studied to see what marijuana can do for people who have cancer, from nausea, with appetite, with Parkinson's, and other illnesses, and glaucoma. We should have it studied. That would be a Schedule 2. I also think that people, marijuana included, who have victimless crimes in federal court, one victimless crime, and have gone 7 years without doing anything else that's wrong, having any other arrest or conviction, should get their records expunged and get a second chance. It's important that Americans get a second chance. And while I have to admit the basis of my position on this is people with drug offenses, it would affect mostly white-collar criminals who might have committed one crime, had 7 years gone clean, and they ought to be able to wipe their records and have a clean record and not have this follow them like a scarlet letter forever. It does say if you had a financial crime of over $25,000, you wouldn't be included, or a sex crime where it's likely to be a recidivist. But otherwise, I would like to ask the chairman and the ranking members, when they mark up other bills, to consider, to have hearings and to have consideration of reforming the marijuana laws to where they are not taking people's liberty and not treating it in a class where it's with LSD and ecstasy, but in a class where it belongs, which really is with alcohol, but not with LSD and ecstasy, to have it be studied, to have children that have epileptic seizures have a chance to have Charlotte's Web studied and to know the efficacy of it and possibly make it available to them, and not to take people's liberties, and to give people second chances with expungement laws. With that, I thank the member, the ranking member, the chairs, and all, and I hope that they will take these issues into consideration in the future and bring us closer to what justice should be, and have the American people have more respect for Congress for dealing with issues that hit them at the everyday level and affect people's lives. And it makes our criminal justice system look like a joke to so many people, to think people are getting arrested, losing their liberty because of smoking marijuana that most people in America now think should be legal. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Are there any amendments to the amendment?
It wasn't an amendment, it was a statement, because I was...
No, there's an amendment under
Oh, I see.
consideration.
Thank you. I thank you.
The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Utah. Those in favor will respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. At this point, I'd ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter to myself and Ranking Member Conyers from Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform, Timothy Head, Executive Director of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, Jason Pye, Director of Justice Reform for Freedom Works, Craig DeRoche, Senior Vice President, Advocacy and Public Policy, Prison Fellowship, and Eli Lehrer, President of R Street Institute, in support of this legislation. And I'd also like to give special thanks. We don't often do this in this committee. We should do it more often. But special thanks to our legislative counsel from the Office of Legislative Counsel, Megan Chasnoff, for her tremendous work on this bill. Thank you, Megan. With that, a reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 759 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor will respond by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably. Members will have 2 days to submit views, and without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Don't go anywhere. We have more. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2947 for purposes of markup and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2947, to amend Title 11 of the United States Code in order to facilitate the resolution of an insolvent financial institution in bankruptcy.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. In 2008, our economy suffered one of the most significant financial crises in history. In the midst of the crisis, and in response to a fear that some financial firms' failures could cause severe harm to the overall economy, the federal government provided extraordinary taxpayer-funded assistance in order to prevent certain financial firms' failures. In the ensuing years, experts from the financial, regulatory, legal, and academic communities have examined how best to prevent another similar crisis from occurring and to eliminate the possibility of using taxpayer monies to bail out failing firms. The Judiciary Committee has advanced the review of this issue with the aim of crafting a solution that will better equip our bankruptcy laws to resolve failing firms while also encouraging greater private counterparty diligence in order to reduce the likelihood of another financial crisis. Among other things, this responded to provisions of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act that called for an examination of how to improve the bankruptcy code in this area. Last Congress, after 3 hearings, the Judiciary Committee favorably reported the Financial Institution Bankruptcy Act, legislation that improved the bankruptcy code to better facilitate a resolution of a financial firm. That legislation was the culmination of a bipartisan process that solicited and incorporated the views of a wide range of leading experts and relevant regulators. The bill ultimately passed the House by a voice vote under suspension of the rules. This Congress, Representative Trott reintroduced the Financial Institution Bankruptcy Act as H.R. 2947. Following its introduction, the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law conducted a hearing on the bill. The hearing witnesses all supported the legislation while providing recommendations for further refinements to the bill. Those recommendations have been incorporated into a manager's amendment. As a result, the bill before us today is the product of a careful, deliberate, and thorough process and reflects a diverse range of views from a variety of interested parties. The Financial Institution Bankruptcy Act makes several improvements to the bankruptcy code in order to enhance the prospect of an efficient resolution of a financial firm through the bankruptcy process. The bill allows for a speedy transfer of the operating assets of a financial firm over the course of a weekend. This quick transfer allows the financial firm to continue to operate in the normal course, which preserves the value of the enterprise for the creditors of the bankruptcy without a significant impact on the firm's employees, suppliers, and customers. The bill also requires expedited judicial review by a bankruptcy judge randomly chosen from a pool of judges designated in advance and selected by the Chief Justice for their experience, expertise, and willingness to preside over these complex cases. Furthermore, the legislation provides for key regulatory input throughout the process. The Financial Institution Bankruptcy Act is a bipartisan, balanced approach that increases transparency and predictability in the resolution of a financial firm. Furthermore, it ensures that shareholders and creditors, not taxpayers, bear the losses related to the failure of a financial company. I am pleased that Ranking Member Conyers joined in introducing this important legislation and want to thank him and his staff for their efforts in developing this bill. I would also like to thank Chairman Marino of the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law, who chaired the hearing on this legislation and is one of the original co-sponsors of the bill. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation and yield back, and at this time it is my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. As an original co-sponsor of H.R. 2947, there are several reasons I'd like to advance as supporting this measure and finding it to be of extremely important usefulness. To begin with, the bill addresses a real need recognized by regulatory agencies, bankruptcy experts, and the private sector to amend the bankruptcy law so that it can expeditiously restore trust in the financial marketplace after the collapse of a major financial institution. As we all recall, the failure of Lehman Brothers in 2008 caused a worldwide freeze on the availability of credit, which not only affected Wall Street, but Main Street as well. Even after Lehman sought bankruptcy relief, the filing did not prevent the near collapse of our national economy. The Lehman case revealed that current bankruptcy law is ill-equipped to deal with complex financial institutions in economic distress. H.R. 2947 addresses these shortcomings by establishing a specialized form of bankruptcy relief whereby the holding company of a large financial institution could expeditiously obtain such relief while allowing its operating subsidiaries to function outside of bankruptcy. Through this mechanism, the debtor's principal assets, such as its secured property, financial contracts, and the stock of its subsidiaries, would be transferred to a temporary bridge company, which in turn would liquidate these assets for the benefit of debtors under the supervision of a trustee. This process should reduce the likelihood of disruption to the financial marketplace and avoid any worldwide freeze of the availability of credit. Now, I also support this bill because it appropriately recognizes the important role of Dodd-Frank Act in the regulation of large financial institutions. Without doubt, the Great Recession was a direct result of the regulatory equivalent of the Wild West. What do I mean? In the absence of any meaningful regulation of the mortgage industry, lenders developed high-risk subprime mortgages and used predatory marketing tactics targeting the most vulnerable. These doomed-to-fail mortgages were then securitized and sold to unsuspecting investors, including pension funds and school districts. Millions of Americans were trapped in mortgages they could no longer afford, causing vast waves of foreclosures, massive unemployment, and international economic upheaval. The Dodd-Frank Act goes a long way toward reinvigorating a regulatory system that makes the financial marketplace more accountable, more transparent, and more resilient. Nevertheless, H.R. 2947 will make the Dodd-Frank Act even more effective by ensuring the bankruptcy law is better equipped to resolve these companies. Finally, I'm pleased that the bill is the product of a very collaborative, inclusive, and deliberative process. While an excellent measure, it unfortunately does not include any provision allowing the federal government to be a lender of last resort, which nearly every expert recognizes is a necessary element to ensure financial stability. I recognize, however, that this is an issue not within the jurisdiction of the House Judiciary Committee. Again, I want to acknowledge the excellent level of cooperation on both sides of the aisle in producing the legislation that is pending before us today, and accordingly, I urge my colleagues to support the measure. I thank the chair and yield back the balance of my time.
The chair thanks the gentleman. Without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Trott, for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of substitute.
I want to thank the chairman for scheduling this markup, and also Chairman Marino for his work in moving this bill forward, and also Ranking Member
Let's call the amendment up first, and then I'll get right back to you. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2947, offered by Mr. Trott of Michigan.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read, and I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for scheduling this markup, and Chairman Marino for your efforts in moving the bill forward, and Ranking Member Conyers for his bipartisan support. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes several revisions to the introduced bill. Most significantly, the amendment removes the Federal Reserve's ability to initiate an involuntary bankruptcy petition against a financial institution. At the July 9th hearing before the Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, all of the witnesses testified in support of this revision. The witnesses stated that it was highly unlikely that an involuntary petition would ever be filed, and that the Federal Reserve already has sufficient regulatory power to compel a financial institution into a Subchapter 5 bankruptcy process. The amendment also clarifies that the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals for the district in which the Subchapter 5 case is commenced will be the person who randomly selects the bankruptcy judge to preside over the case from the pre-designated pool of judges. This revision reflects comments provided by the Administrative Office of the Courts. Finally, the legislation makes several clarifying technical revisions to the introduced text. For example, the amendment clarifies that the term agreement includes qualified financial contracts, as well as revises the short title to refer to the year 2016 rather than 2015. Mr. Chairman, we all see the deep frustration in the American people. While families are working hard to pay their taxes, far too often Washington seems to waste tax money and has proven to be a bad steward of our nation's finances. Many of us were disappointed to see $700 billion spent on bailing out failed financial institutions back in 2008. The American people should not be on the hook for the failures of bad business practices. That's why this important effort is aimed at reducing the risks of another taxpayer-funded bailout of failing banks and reducing the risks of disruption to our economy by the failure of a large financial institution. The legislation protects taxpayers by reforming the process of how banks proceed through bankruptcy. The single point of entry contemplated in H.R. 2947 is also available utilizing the FDIC as a receiver pursuant to Title II of Dodd-Frank. H.R. 2947 makes the single point of entry solution available through the Bankruptcy Code as well. Many commentators believe a bankruptcy solution to handle the failure of a large, systemically important financial institution is a preferable resolution strategy. The individuals who testified before our committee indicated that transparency, due process, impartial administration, and the precedents associated with the bankruptcy process will provide an orderly process which in turn will minimize the risk of significant disruption to the financial system and will also place the risks of loss appropriately on shareholders and creditors and not the American taxpayer. Finally, under my plan, the bankruptcy process will be handled by an experienced judge who has the expertise to implement critical decisions within extremely tight time frames to ensure the continuity and stability in our global markets. This bill is the kind of common sense legislation that I believe offers important solutions, protects the American people, protects our economy, and is deserving of bipartisan support. I encourage all of my colleagues on the committee to support this effort. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I rise in support of this manager's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And to congratulate my colleague from Michigan, Mr. Trott, for his proposal here today. The amendment eliminates one of the problematic provisions of H.R. 2947, the Financial Institution Bankruptcy Act, that witnesses cited at the hearing held on this legislation last year. As many of you know, Title II of the Dodd-Frank Act authorizes the Federal Reserve Board under certain circumstances to involuntarily place a systematically important financial institution into a orderly resolution process. As originally drafted, H.R. 2947 gave similar powers to the board whereby it could apply to the court for an order forcing a financial institution involuntarily into the specialized form of bankruptcy relief established under the bill. Based on testimony received at the hearing from the National Bankruptcy Conference and other witnesses, as well as in formal consultations held with interested parties, it was determined that this authority was unnecessary and that it possibly presented due process concerns given the contracted 48-hour time frame that the bill provides for the court to make its required determination. Also, in response to informal suggestions provided by the Administrative Office of the United States Courts, the amendment revises the bill's provisions concerning notice provided to the federal courts and judge selection. And finally, the amendment makes a number of technical revisions clarifying the treatment of qualified financial contracts. So in sum, this amendment improves the bill from both substantive as well as technical perspectives, and accordingly I support it and urge my colleagues to do so as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Are there any amendments to the amendment? The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2947. Those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 2947 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays have been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Ms. Walters? Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes yes. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Conyers?
Aye.
Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Aye. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Pierluisi? Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye.
The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Forbes votes aye.
The gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Buck votes aye.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu. Oh, sorry. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
Mr. Poe votes yes.
The gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Delbene. She's already voted. Has every member voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 25 members voted aye, 0 members voted no.
And the ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business today. I want to thank all the members for their participation, and we thank you all for attending and for your good work on both these bills in a very bipartisan fashion, and the markup is adjourned.